Welcome to That Annuity Show, the podcast that will make you an expert in explaining annuities to your clients. Give us 30 minutes each week and we'll shave hours from your client presentations. Now, here's your host, Paul Tyler.
Hi, this is Paul Tyler, and welcome to another episode of That Annuity Show. We have our full crew here today. Bruno, welcome from the north.
Good morning. Thank you.
Yeah. Ramsey, you're looking very, very professional today on Friday.
I'm north of where I usually am. I'm in New York instead of Atlanta. It's always glad to be on the show and back in New York.
Yeah. Tisa, good to see you. Today was momentous. We crossed the $1 billion sales threshold, which we were all kind of sweating for the last few months here. But it was a big year.
Virtual pep rally this morning was a nice way to start a Friday.
Congratulations, guys.
Yeah, so it was a big deal for where we started a few years ago and where we are today. But it has been an interesting market the last 6 to 9 months. But we have a great guest on, in fact, a returning guest. Today we have on our show Jamie Hopkins, who almost needs no introduction for our audience, but is managing partner of Wealth Solutions at Carson Group and co-author of a new book called Find Your Freedom, Financial Planning for a Life on Purpose. Life of Purpose. Jamie, welcome.
Hey, Paul and team, Ramsey, Tisa, Bruno, good to see everyone.
Yeah.
Good to see you.
Yeah. And lots, I guess a lot's changed and some hasn't. I think we had you on the show back just right when we were sort of headed nose first into the pandemic, right?
That there was a pandemic, Paul, that
there was. The books say it. I think we were, talking about, all the type of adaptation that has to take place. Mm-hmm. And so today, listen, we'd like to cover a couple topics. One is, I want to talk to you about our book. Love to get your perspective on, what has changed and not changed in the last couple of years as you're, talking to your advisors. And then, a topic I think that's on everybody's mind, the new Secure Act, coming out of Congress. So with that, I think, talk to us a little bit about the book. You actually, first chapter or second chapter leads out about you say financial plan is personal, is a very deeply personal story. What was yours? And love to hear some of the backstory here.
Yeah, well, I'll get to my story. The book's been fun. I talk a little bit about the process of it because I think there was a good lesson in it. I actually started a book last year and got about halfway through and ended up scrapping the whole thing and then writing this one. So I scrapped half a book, which feels, if you've ever written anything, is like when you talk about sunk cost, like that was one where you're like, should I just finish this? And it was just the wrong book. And so we scrapped that, and then I wrote, Find Your Freedom. And that hit Wall Street Journal bestseller, I think, maybe 2-3 weeks ago. So that's awesome. It's exciting just to see it actually kind of pick up steam and resonate with people. And Ron shares a little bit of his story in the book. More of the book is my story. Honestly, if you read it, what you'll see is Ron's kind of adding pieces, and it's more of a journey along where my path has gone. And so I started off just with the loss of my dad at an early age. I was 8 years old, and kind of some of the trauma that comes along with that, and sharing different family dynamics and my experiences with money and gifting and scarcity mindset at a young age. And my dad did construction and passed away, did gutters, and fell off of a roof when it was icing up, and passed away. And I was 8 years old, and kind of left my family in a very difficult situation, which is not, it's not uncommon out there. Like, since I wrote the book, it's actually a really kind of powerful thing, is I've just gotten a lot of emails of people sharing their own stories of lost loved ones. And it's not always parents. Sometimes it's sisters or brothers, but it gives people that permission to like open up about that, because often, that stuff we're almost like told, like, you shouldn't talk about it. And I don't know that many people have much education or training or experience, like how to deal with people grieving. It actually came up this morning. We had an advisor that lost 2 clients and passing away in the last 2 weeks of the year. And we were just talking about like all this stuff that we kind of naturally do that's kind of wrong. Like we try to pat people and tell them it's okay, which is like the wrong way to approach somebody grieving, right? You're actually what you're actually naturally doing there is reacting and saying like, you're making me uncomfortable, so please calm down, right? Like that's actually what you're doing in that moment. And people, generally speaking, don't like that. If you look at a lot of the research, it's more like you don't touch people. It's more like, hey, I'm listening. You're active. You lean in. It's more on that side of things. And we don't always react well with that, but it's interesting just seeing these messages come through, since I've read the book and put it out there.
Well, I mean, that's an interesting life lesson, and it speaks to how there's like so much interaction in this space between the sort of the quantitative and the financial part of it and the emotional elements, and it's really hard to be effective in this space, in the personal finance space, if you don't sort of navigate both of those tracks. So thank you for sharing that. That's remarkable.
Yeah, it's one of the things I got wrong about the first book, Ramsey, is I wrote the whole first book like it was like a textbook on financial planning. And it's like I just dove right into planning and numbers. I had all these spreadsheets that I was working on, and I was like I might like this, but man, this is boring. And so when I rewrote the book, the whole first half of it is like, what does freedom mean to you? What's your relationship with money? What's the trauma that you've survived through? What are the experiences that you don't want to have or do want to pass along to your children and heirs, and what's the legacy you want to leave behind? So that's the whole front half. It's really, there's no talk about numbers or finances really. It's about you as a person and finding that level of freedom and happiness.
And so in terms of so now you've done that in the book. In terms of how you apply that, how do you apply that with your day-to-day business at Carson? Like, so with the advisors that you essentially advise the advisors, right? How do you navigate that with a high-performing set of advisors at Carson?
Yeah, it's been fun. So a lot of people look at things like a book, and it's part of a much bigger strategy, right? Like I wrote a book this time for a very particular purpose, which was to, in my view, like codify our approach to financial planning at Carson for clients, prospects, and advisors too, right? Like anyone who wants to kind of know what it is. And so the second half of the book's really the financial planning process that we use at Carson and what we kind of expect from a planning promise. Now, that was like what I would say is like the retail side of codifying it. Internally, we had something that we call the proven process, which is our systems and processes for financial planning inside of Carson. And that's where our tech integrates, like workflows integrate, our training integrates. And then we've actually built out internally of like the book Find Your Freedom. We have a Find Your Freedom planning process for advisors too, so they can actually like leverage pieces of the book with their clients, and then how that ties back to all the resources we have. So if we, one of the chapters later on, we talk about long-term care. So then in that work area for advisors inside of Carson, you've got training materials, you've got like the fact-finding spreadsheets if you want to go out and talk to somebody about long-term care. Then we've got the resources that we have internally, and then the tools to analyze it. So for the advisor side, we've actually built all of that on the back end, so they've like systematized their practice. And that's really where Ron, the reason that we're all sitting here too is like, Ron built this amazing firm on the wealth side, right? He was the, I think that you guys were talking about the $1 billion celebration, which is amazing. And Ron always tells this story about at LPL back in the 90s. Ron was the first advisor, at least at LPL, to hit 25 million of advisory assets, right? And LPL threw a party. It was this big celebration, because like that was first. He was like this trailblazer on it. And nowadays, right, people get a single client with 50 million of advisory. But he built this whole process, and that's really where we kind of came about. And so I sit across Wealth Solutions now, which is everything kind of financial planning oriented. And we still have that as core, which is coaching and process. And we believe in those two things and putting clients first. And I think as long as you do that, it's not just in this world, but in most areas of the world, you'll see success, right? You deliver value and you articulate value and you have a repeatable way to do that. And then, that's where businesses grow.
Oh, that's great. And in your book, you somewhat, frame and you bring forward the fact that your personal background has a lot to do with how you're going to manage money. Are there any, common denominators or any ways to frame, different categories of various people or various schools of thoughts that are out there?
Yeah, so I would say just like with clients or advisors or even your own life, there's a lot of bucketing or segmentation or mental accounting, whichever term you want to use, going on all the time. So, when I look at advisors, we run a coaching program at Carson. We got about 1,200 firms that use Carson coaching. But they're all over the place, right? You have growers, you've got lifestyle businesses, you've got people that really want to acquire. And then their approaches to how they operate their business are very different. You have some that have to be really great general managers. You want to have 19 different offices all over the country. You take a very different approach to the person who wants to work with 35 clients. And then if you're thinking about individuals, I think the really interesting thing is how, what I say is domain specific we are. And a lot of times you'll be like, that's a brilliant person. Like I'll look at Ramsey and be like, man, Ramsey's such a smart guy. But there's probably a couple areas where everybody on the show would be like, Ramsey really knows nothing about this. He's really smart in some areas, right? But there are some areas he's probably not as sharp. And it's the same for me. I know, I've never, this is one, it's kind of silly, but I've never played a game of baseball in my entire life. I'm a pretty good athlete. I was a 2-sport Division I athlete. I could probably learn to play baseball. But I can't catch with a glove on. I can catch without a glove on. I can't hit. I can't do any of those things in baseball. But, right, I was a, captain of a Division I scholarship athlete. I'm a good athlete, or I was. Now I'm old, but I was very domain specific there. And when I think about my knowledge, I'm pretty good in financial planning, tax areas. If you take me into the CFA world and analyzing funds, I can't analyze a fund for you in any meaningful way. So even in our world, I become very domain specific. And then when you look at individuals doing their planning, they might be pretty risk tolerant in one area of their life and completely risk averse in another. And I find that to be super interesting, even inside of retirement accounts versus their play funds. People behave so differently. I'm fairly I would say in investing, I personally don't mind taking on a lot of risk. But then when you look at other areas of my behavior, I don't exhibit that same aspect. I don't like gifting a lot of money. I'm not very frivolous on that side. I like more certainty when it comes to certain areas. And so, yeah, the domains of people and approaches, whether it's to planning or business or your own investing, it's very different for a lot of different people. And I think the main takeaway in the book is that's perfectly okay. To your question, Bruno, is it's okay. And you can give yourself permission to do it differently than your neighbor does if that's what makes you happy. You don't have to do it the same way that I do or some, talking head on TV does or what Congress tells you to do either, right? You can do it your way where you find your freedom.
So I'll jump in. I have a kind of a follow-up question to that. What do you think is kind of your opinion on the influence or the impact of setting that style? You mentioned the scarcity mindset of growing up and experiencing a loss early, obviously had an income impact to your household. Is it how your parents raised you and what their savings patterns were? Is it your level of success? You make more money so you can make different decisions. What do you think is the biggest sort of influence or a combination of influences that set that risk tolerance and that mindset?
Yeah, Tisa, it's such an amazing question. And I don't think that there's a simple answer to this, but there are some things that, from research out there and then some of the things I feel like I've learned. at least my experiences tell me. And you actually have both. So you have this, the saying, right, that apple doesn't fall far from the tree or whatever, which is this idea of like, there you have some natural habitat in which is forming your experiences in life. I mean, that's kind of what it's talking about, right? Like gravity, maybe if on the top of a hill, it can roll all the way down a hill. Then maybe if you get really lucky, some animal picks you up and carries you another 50 feet. And but that's kind of it, right? Like we've extended the furthest out version. Then maybe you fall into a river and but you can move. But it's not easy. And so a lot of this stuff is, I always say our experiences, right, don't necessarily define us, but they do drive us. And so it's this idea of where that came from is driving us. But you do have people that react the opposite way that their parents or grandparents react. And that's this, idea of, kind of generational experiences being passed on. And there's some research that says that trauma in a family can be passed on for up to 8 generations, which is tremendous when you think about that. I see more clearly 3, but I totally understand where in some cases, right, if you talk about slavery in the United States, clearly there's generational that's more than 3, that we're still having impacts of that today, right? That's pretty clear. We see that. But other cases, maybe 3 generations is more normal for some trauma. But I use the example of my mom and my grandmother in the book, and neither one of them are happy about that, by the way, too. It's caused an internal, fight because I'm they love gifting, and the book came out by Christmas, and they're like, you're Scrooge. And the way that they express love is to buy gifts for their family members, right? And that's how they express love. I, however, don't like gifting now. I'm not a huge fan of giving gifts. It's not the way I express love, even though I understand that, for my mom, that's super important. And, I don't want to stop her from doing that, but it's explaining that, hey, I don't get the same enjoyment you did. So I kind of had, the counteraction of that. But if you look at my mom, she clearly inherited that from my grandmother. 2 of my aunts are identical. They all love Christmas and going big, and every year they say they're going to spend less and they spend more, right? And it's that, but they love it. And I don't want to take that away from them. But that's one that's passed on. Then for me, it changed, right? My experiences were enough different that I had a different reaction to that. So it definitely does influence us. It drives us. It's not all inherited that we're going to be the same as the previous generation. And then I think ultimately, we probably focus in the behavioral world too much on changing the individual and not enough on changing the environment. And I think that's a really important lesson. The more I've spent in the behavioral world and change behavior is that we usually say well, how can we make Bruno or Paul act differently? The reality is it's really hard to make a person act differently. What we have to do is change the environment that they're in, and then we're more likely to see behavior change. So the best example of that in our retirement world has been the 401k retirement plan, automatic enrollment, and auto escalation, is that we actually accepted the fact that no matter how much education we did and TV ads and pamphlets and pizza lunches to get people to learn about it, we couldn't change individual behavior to save more. That most of that stuff kind of went to waste. It was not very efficient or effective. And then what we decided to do was change the environment. And so by changing the environment, we created a different system, right, that allowed people to save more by giving them choice too, but then they didn't make the choice, right? We just let things be. But that is actually a true example of how we changed the environment and not the individual to change the behavior. And I think that we skip that a lot. And it's just interesting because in the behavioral research world, the actual research world, they're very focused on the environmental factors. When we get to personal finance, it's kind of like the game of telephone, and we've distorted it 3 times. And we have a variation of what the research actually said, but we do tend to put too much of it back on individuals, which I think is interesting. And maybe it's just because we deal in personal finance and we deal with individuals, so we want to take those lessons and apply them to people. But a lot of that research is actually about system and how do you change systems, not how do you change an individual's behavior. So I know I kind of went way off there, Tita, but hopefully it's somewhat.
No, that's good. And I mean, to your point, right, that's what the new legislation is doing. It's changing the environment. Mm-hmm. And then hopefully, behavior shift based on those constructs, if you will.
No, this generational, your generational legacy really does shape how you look at money, and it is interesting. Jamie, the holidays bring it out. Like, I'm going to say my mother really was a child of the Depression, and it was just fresh still, right? And then my wife's family had very, very different backgrounds, and just the Christmas traditions are so different. It's kind of fascinating, but very important for an advisor to understand that. I mean, I think if I were working with Ramsey or Tisa, to be able to communicate at that level would make me a much more powerful advisor. I've watched Ron on LinkedIn. I love his content. I mean, I would not look at his content and say he's a financial advisor. I think he's more of a life coach.
Yeah.
Now, how are you thinking about, future, your future advisor? What are the skills or firm? You mentioned, some person's good, some people are good at tennis, some people are good at baseball. How does the dynamic shift if you're trying to get, me to really trust, not only give you the information, trust you, but really let you help me, unwind some of these things that may be leading me down the wrong financial path?
It's a great question. And, this is the third Ron I've known now, too. There was a Ron that looked a lot like the original financial advisor, right? The Ron today is a little bit different and his role shifted, right? He's, I think he still has a couple clients that he works with that are fairly large. He's had for a long time. But for the most part, he's delegated those out. And that's, I wrote that, we did a growth forum yesterday, and I ended up with 39 different things that in my chicken scratch in this notebook here. I still write everything in a book, but that could help advisors grow. And I thought the super interesting when I ended up with 39 was that, they're not all, not everybody would use all 39, right? But all 39 of them, I kind of took away of an advisor working with us. Somebody would benefit from all 39. When you think about advisors and growth, and I mentioned a little this before, was, you have to deliver value. You've got to be able to articulate value. But then growth is kind of that rate times volume. Like, how much of it can you do at what rate? And ultimately, in our space, one of the biggest challenges for advisors to grow is time, because our profession is still very client equals some amount of time, right? Like, different advisors spend different amounts of time with them, but pretty much they all equal. If you're in the personal advisory world and you're an advisor, a client equals some amount of your time. So how do you delegate away and free up as much time as possible to do the thing that you deliver the most value in? So whether that's becoming the Rainmaker lead advisor, and you're not really working with a lot of clients day to day, and you're outsourcing some of that, insourcing it, and then just daily tasks. Like, are you the one doing trades? And what we've seen is, from Carson's perspective, when we've brought on advisors, when I joined, we were about 70 people. We have about 350 in the home office, and we went from, 6 billion and 7,000 households to 45,000 households in the last 5 years. And so just kind of exploded, and a lot of advisors have come on board, but it's taking a lot of that other stuff away so they can focus on being an advisor. And sometimes it's challenging, and Ron's great at this, is challenge the mentality of so you think that picking all the stocks is really what adds value to your clients. And a lot of advisors are still out there doing that. And really what you are doing in that situation, 95% of the time, is just putting a time restraint on the ability for you to deliver value and impact more people. And so you run into those advisors, and they're not growing as fast as other people are growing, and they're wondering why. And you look at their day and you said, well, 80% of your day has nothing to do with the true value you deliver. So you need to get rid of 80% of that day. And then you have the capacity now to 4x your value, right? And so that's usually where it starts. It's kind of where our coaching drove from. And then I think a really other interesting area of growth opportunity for advisors out there today, and I talked about this with some of our about 40 advisors on the call right before I hopped on here, was paying attention to wallet share. I run into advisors all the time. They think they have a lot more wallet share than they do. TD, who at the time I think was doing about the best out there of collecting wallet share, they had about 17 to 18% of a client's wallet share. So if you were working with a major custodian and your client's money's all at one, you probably don't have, right? Like it's just math, right? Like you can't have 100%, like all these advisors can't have 100% at the custodian when the custodians look at it and realize they have 18%, right? Like it just doesn't work. You probably have a lot less of their wallet share than you even think you do. And sometimes, when you really dive into it 5-6 years later, they're like, oh, I didn't know you had 3 other advisors, right? And like, yeah, I've got 100,000 here and 50,000 here. And even when they're doing planning, sometimes that stuff, sits outside of their view. And I think the more planning you do, and I don't know who was saying this earlier, but the more listening you do in those situations, the better. When you just talk a lot, that's when you don't get the answers back to that. There are some technologies out there now that are allowing you to see those held away assets more clearly, so you can have those conversations too about like, hey, we see this is over here. Do you want us to help with that? Or even just wrap that number into the planning, even if we're not managing it, is helpful.
So I would love to transition a bit and spend a little time talking about Secure 2.0. You've been very prolific already on LinkedIn, sharing what you think are some of the critical of the I think there's 100 different modifications that have been made in the retirement space, and you highlighted some of the more important ones. But you brought up auto enrollment earlier as sort of a key element, and it seems to me that that's also enhancing that particular function is also a part of Secure Act 2.0. So would love to get your take on what you think the key issues are and key opportunities for participants and for advisors.
Yeah, I'll try to dive into that a bit. One thing I will kind of put a caveat around right now is that, even though you said I've been prolific, I think I've done 3 presentations, I've got 3 different decks, I don't know, all this other stuff. I wrote 28 pages on it the very first day it came out. So that was like, and I woke up the next morning at 7:30 a.m. and presented. And I was like, that's probably the first like PowerPoint presentation that was done on it, was that morning at 7:30 a.m. because it was, about 24 hours when the first version of it dropped. But we're going to figure out planning opportunities with this throughout the year. Some of it will come down to when the IRS, Department of Labor, Treasury, which is tied to the IRS, but when they start giving us more guidance in some of the regs here, it will open up or shut down certain planning opportunities. But when you think about 100 plus provisions, it's pretty tremendous, and it's probably the last really big retirement. I would say modification, kind of this one, Secure Act, Pension Protection Act. I don't see another one in the next coming years now like this. What we're going to go to coming up now is the Social Security, Medicare type conversations, less so about modifications to the existing system. So I think that's the good news, is change on this side has been a lot in the last couple of years. Expect it to slow down for a while. Now, most of the bills that have been floating around in D.C. directly related to this, I think we've had enough of that right now. There's probably 6 really big areas of planning opportunity in there, so I'll kind of start with those if we want to dive into them. So the first one is just, look, RMD ages are changing again, so that's a big part of it, right? We're 73 already now this year. We'll go to 75 in about a decade. Gives people more time to push off taking withdrawals out. The reality is that will impact some people. It's not super clear on that provision alone is not going to live up to the secure name, setting every community up for a retirement enhancement. Even at age 70 and a half, I think it was only about 18% of people didn't take out more than their RMD at that point. 72, I don't know, the IRS has ever given us data, but it's less than 18%. And then 75 will be something less than that. And then also remember, only about 2/3 of Americans have anything saved for retirement at all. So we're talking about 18% of 2/3 of America, and then 10% of two. So we might be talking about less than 5% of people that end up being impacted by that type of change. Now, for advisors' clients, it's like half of your clients. So it's much more substantial when you get to the advisory world of the impact. It gives more opportunity for Roth conversions, but it does open up conversations about, like, do you need to take more out anyway? Even if RMDs are pushed off, that we're doing conversions, we're just taking distributions under the 10-year distribution rule for a lot of inherited accounts. It's not clear that the best strategy is just push off everything into the future, because you could be actually creating a bigger tax explosion at the end now by cramming all these assets into this tax deferred, distributed over a shorter period of time in a potentially higher tax rate environment than we've ever seen before, which I think is how most people feel. I don't talk to very many people who are like, I expect taxes to be lower in 10 years. I never run in, like, if I get in a room full of 100 people and I say, raise your hand if you think taxes are going to be lower in 10 years, nobody raises their hand. It's just not what the macro environment is looking like in this country. So deferring taxes too long right now might not be the best thing. Huge planning opportunity there. When it comes to the plan side, there's, that's where most of the provision changes are. I will say, if you haven't really dove into it, really, honestly, like, these are pretty good common sense changes from Congress. I know, shocking. Everybody feels like, is he really being honest there? Yes, like, these are pretty common sense changes. They mostly make plans more efficient, more easy to run, more flexibility, right? Simplifying down things that added a lot of complexity to the industry. That is good. I mean, like, just across the board in 5 years, this simplifies some of the stuff in the plan world, even requiring simplified rollover forms and standardization there. Like, that is good for everybody. That didn't benefit a single entity out there by having complex rollover forms. Annuities, especially QLACs, got a boost in probably two different areas at least. The aggregation rules around RMDs and IRAs. That's a super complex area, and they did simplify that down. It doesn't penalize annuities as much, which I think is interesting. I haven't spent enough time to figure out the impact on that and QLACs. Nobody's written on it. Nobody's really discussed it yet, but it's there too, and it's kind of, that's a side endeavor. They did improve QLACs by removing the 25% account aggregation total amount you could put in and increasing the total amount that you could send into premiums. So I'd say those are two good things. Added some abilities for some additional riders to go on annuities and not run afoul of RMD rules. So annuities got a boost in here inside the plan. So definitely an opportunity to find more creative annuity lifetime income solutions and put more money into them inside of your qualified plan arena. So I hit 3 there. I will pause. I did say I have 6, but I know that's a lot, so I don't know if we want to hit any of them, or you want me to just, I can talk on this stuff for days and days and days, so we don't have that time.
And perhaps on the elements that are conducive to sort of broader employer participation in the space, so multi-employer plans and the like. I think that's sort of an important development.
It is. And, that was part of the original Secure Act. They made some clarifications here and just who could participate. That is still an area, as I put that caveat in. A lot of companies, plan providers, are still waiting for guidance there, though. I think before we see that takeoff of the MEPs and the PEPs, they have increased, but I think before we actually see that massive explosion there, if it ever occurs, we still need guidance from especially the Labor Department on that side. But this one, it reduced down some complications. The kind of easier version of this 401k in there, where it's only employee contributions, similar thing, another attempt at how do we get small businesses a cost-effective plan to roll out. We did mention automatic enrollment and escalation, making that mandatory for larger, newer plans running forward. I've written on that one a little bit. While that one sounds super nice, that would have been more effective like 20 years ago. It's just, reality is, like, the impact of that one will be super slow and really long term. Most large companies have plans in place. Most small companies that are startups will be exempted out of the rule. And even most new plans, I think it's like 90% have automatic enrollment today anyway. So it's not like, it sounds good. I don't know how many actual plans and people get impacted or get access due to that change. And then we always have to like couch, does behavior end up different than we think? The like simplified, really easy to use 401k, does that create plans that are less costly to the employer? And so people don't end up with as much money in there. There's no, we don't add matching in, so people don't say it. Like, there's some of that behavioral stuff in there that, like, we could get wrong on that one. Like, it's, again, sounds good. There's a reason to try it. But we could look back in a decade and be like, well, that was a failure. The MIRA, which is a great example of that the federal government tried to start a decade ago now, right? Like maybe 2014 was a complete failure. They ended up spending more money on it than money ever actually went into it. Like, think about that, right? Like, the cost was more expensive than the total number of dollars that ever moved into it. And in theory, like, it was a good attempt. They probably didn't let it run long enough either, but it was such a massive failure so quickly that they did kind of cut bait and leave it. And administrations changed. It wasn't the only thing. But I do think that for advisors and plans, small businesses, the enhanced credits were big. And so that's a talking point. And it was an addition in the original Secure Act, and it was enhanced in this one. So talking to people who might have looked at setting up a plan for their workplace before that didn't do it due to cost, they did lower down the cost by enhancing credits there again. And I think that was kind of lost. We talked about it, Secure Act passed at the end of 2019 and the world shut down. Like, nobody went around talking about enhanced small employer credits in 2020 for setting up retirement plans. Like, that was item number like 592 on the most important things to worry about in 2020, right? But this kind of gives us that talking point to go back out, help small businesses set up plans, run them at a more cost-effective and less kind of laborious manner.
I mean, so that's sort of what I see as a bit of an open question is, so to your point, Secure Act 1.0 came out in 2019, and it may have been a bigger deal had there not been a pandemic. Secure 2.0 does two things. One, it enhances, but it also sort of reminds the whole world about the Secure Act in the first place. So, it'll be, what are your thoughts on that? Do you think that there will be more reaction to Secure 2.0 or the two Secure Acts collectively in the next year or two than we saw in the last year or two as a result of the fact that at least we have a handle on managing the pandemic if we're not completely out of it?
Yeah, Rams, it's a great question. It gave it another opportunity. So, when I went into 2020, I thought my whole year of 2020 was going to be me going around talking to advisors and clients about the Secure Act. And that didn't happen. I had 3 months of that, at best. I don't know, it was 2.5 months. And, there was more attention to the original Secure Act than this one, though. Like, I can just tell media coverage and clients and, kind of being the sequel to anything, usually you don't always live up to the original. Interestingly enough, like, I think this is a better bill than the first one. The first bill, Secure Act 1.0, we had a lot more rushing at the end of the year. There were some planning opportunities. This one's more like an enhancement to the system. The first bill, if you really dive into it, the major provisions were what I call stealth tax increases. I mean, that was the major provision in there was the change of beneficiary beneficiary inherited accounts and moving that to a 10-year. And that is a tax revenue generator for the government. I mean, that's the major provision in the entire thing. And, the flip side was, and I remember talking about this, like, this bill will have an impact if the MEPs and PEPs kind of take off after Secure Act 1.0, and they haven't yet.
Yeah.
So this is another attempt to enhance them. It's not that they didn't occur, but they didn't take off. It's not, like I think I saw somebody say around this one, 100 million more Americans will have access to retirement accounts. And, like, that sounds nice in an article, but, I don't believe that through this one either. Like, I just don't. Like, we've tried to simple SEPs, RCEPs. We've tried this over and over again. And wanting behavior to change is probably my best point, going back to something earlier, is just giving small businesses more opportunities does not change their behavior, right? Like, simples and SEPs are super easy to run. They don't cost a whole lot. They're less complex than a new 401k or a MEP or a PEP is, and we still didn't use them. Right. So it does kind of go back to, it's not that it won't have some impact, but the notion that it's going to give 100 million people more retirement savings, I don't believe. I don't see it. You know,
the question is, how do we change the environment? To your earlier point. So how do we change the environment instead of change the behavior? What's the auto enrollment nudge equivalent in the MEP and PEP space?
So it's like one step further than we got, right? Everything is steps towards something. So now we said, hey, plans, you have to set up automatic enrollment escalation. And then there's going to be some day where we're going to have to make that fundamental decision. Do we require employers to have at some size, right? So it's not going to be 5-person companies, but at 50-person companies and up, you have to allow people some system in which they are automatically enrolled. And states have started to look at that, right? And they've gone that way outside of the federal government. Now, what will push the federal government to have to deal with that is when we get 25 states doing it 25 different ways. You know, right now we kind of have 2-ish states messing around in there. It's not enough to force the federal government's hand. But when we get 25 different states doing it 25 different ways, then that's when the government says, hey, look, this is a federal issue. Stop messing around with retirement stuff. That's our land. We're going to deal with this. But that's like that's something that I would say we don't have agreement on in DC today. Like this other stuff we can get agreement on. Do we require employers to go down that route? Now, look, like we require employers to put money in for retirement accounts today. That's half of Social Security and Medicare. Like we do require that. Like it's not a thing that we have decided not to require in this country, but are we going to take that next step and require, I don't think it's going to be employer contributions, which will be the next version, but do we require you to set up that MEP or PEP or allow people to automatically enroll into a state-run IRA, like some option where we say, look, at 50 people or more, you're going to automatically enroll people into some type of savings, and they can opt out, but you as an employer are going to set that up. That is the changing of the environment that would put 100 million people into saving. But it's kind of one step further than I think anyone is willing to put political capital behind today.
Yeah. Well, listen, we're at close to top of the hour here. Fascinating discussion, Jamie. And Ramsey, I think there's still another piece of legislation to pass. I don't know, call it Retire Hard 3. You know.
And it's definitely a Christmas movie because every year this passes like 2 days before Christmas falls.
Yeah, yeah. You notice these big blockbusters, they're 3.5 hours long sometimes. Like, I don't know if you saw Avatar. That was a long one. Oof.
Not yet.
This is a Secure Act 2. Jamie, God bless you for ripping through that quick. That was a lot. So I guess let me just ask you, Tisa. Last question, thought on the topic. We've covered a lot here.
Yeah, it's more of a comment than a question. Don't know if it already exists, but I think I have your next book, Jamie. When you were talking about how people place value on giving and receiving gifts, reminded me of the 5 love languages. Mm-hmm. We kind of dissect that in our romantic relationships, if you will. But I feel like if financial advisors took that approach with clients, right, understood their motivations, maybe those conversations would look a little different. So, 5 love languages for finance. That's your next book.
Yeah.
I like that.
Thanks for your time today. It was fascinating, and that kind of that attitude and emotion around money is something that, in particular, generationally, how it's passed down is a fascinating topic. So I appreciate you covering it today.
Oh, thank you. And yeah, the 5 love languages, I do mention it briefly in the book. I don't even know if I mention all 5, but I talk about my spouse and I have different love languages, right? Mm-hmm. And that does show its face too in our relationship and how we interact with money. And like my wife likes time-saving activities, so the best gift I can give her are things like hiring a lawn care company, even though I love doing that, right? It's something I like, but it's beneficial to her. So that's a better gift. It's a better way to spend money to create, exponential more happiness. So it's a absolutely perfect example, Tisa.
Yeah, it's key to understanding that. So, yeah.
Excellent. Hey, Bruno.
Hey, if I can sneak one last one in. If we marry the 2 topics we had today, everything that impacts us from the book and Secure Act 2.0, we see the generations that we have, seen growing and retiring, living with pensions and strong social security. Now this environment has changed. How is that going to, how are people going to live up to that in the next in the generations to come, now that that environment has changed? Like, do we flip back the environment? How do we go to that step?
Yeah, Bruno, it's a great question. What happened over time is we used to talk about the three-legged stool, right? Employer, individual, and government, and we shifted that burden more to the individual. So that stool is wobbly now because the idea is you need to make enough money to save. You got to figure that out mostly on your own. The question will become, does the government, who sets the policy from the people, but will we stabilize that in some way? And do we shift more burden back to the employer? Do we shift more burden back to the government? And right now, the burden has shifted on the individual. And I'd say the financial markets have tried to fill in that piece, right? We have more products and more advisor solutions and technology. But it's, I don't know that it's enough long term. One thing I always talk about if it comes up is Social Security. I do not believe, and I could be wrong here because I'd be wrong about lots of things or anything, but I do not believe personally that we will see a time where Social Security is gone in my life in this country. A lot of people believe that, but it's more of a lack of understanding how the system works. We are not saving enough today for the people who are in their 40s and 50s to offset the loss of Social Security. So unless as a country, either one, we just literally can't afford it anymore. Which is always a possibility. But or two, I don't think we're okay with saying that we're fine with all of our seniors living in poverty, right? Like, I just don't, more than half of retirees, right? 2/3 of retirees, their primary source of income is Social Security. I don't think we're okay walking around saying we're okay with 2/3 of our seniors living in poverty by letting the system go to the wayside.
Yeah. Ramsey, I know you've got a lot here.
Yeah, we covered a lot of issues. I totally agree with you, Jamie, on the on Social Security and its role in U.S. culture and society. I think it's hard to view a version of it that's much less than where we currently see it. Thanks very much for your perspective on the Secure Act, sort of like the both its potential and maybe some of its limitations. I really like this notion of thinking of the framework of changing the environment, not focusing on behavior, because I agree with you completely that you can spend a lot of time on education, and it's you can't educate people at the same rate that they need to actually use the content of that education in their day-to-day lives. So creating an environment that sort of leads them or nudges them to where they need to be, while they learn, I think is critical to success. So thank you for sharing that.
Yeah. I'll drop one of my friends, Jess. She said this is my favorite thing I've ever said, and I mess it up sometimes. But it's education without execution just creates smarter people doing the same dumb things.
All right, that's our quote.
That's
our quote for the LinkedIn post.
That's great. Well, hey, Jamie, thanks so much for your time. We'll put links to your book in the notes. If anybody wants to find that, we'll put a link there. Link to your website, maybe, and firm as well. So thanks for your time. One last off-the-cuff question here. Did you go to Burning Man with
No, I didn't go to Burning Man with Ron.
With Ron.
No, look, Rick, Ron hired me, delegated, so he could, I read the Secure Act and he can go to Burning Man. He's living his freedom and I'm living mine. So
okay,
yeah, look, he's a smart guy.
All right, well, listen, thanks to all our listeners. Give us feedback, shoot us notes as you always do, and join us again next week for another episode of That Annuity Show. Thanks.
Thanks for listening. If you've enjoyed the show, please rate and recommend us on iTunes, Stitcher, Overcast, or wherever you get your podcasts. You can also get more information at thatannuityshow.com.